we watched Far Beyond the Stars, which I think is one of the best episodes of Deep Space Nine, but it's also very weird.
It is weird.
For that show.
It's weird, but I have to say I thought it was very creative how they handle it.
Do you want to talk about this episode a little bit deeper?
Yes. Captain Sisko, the great Captain Sisko, feels like he is really having a burnout as far as having the position of being captain. Also
because a lot of his friends are dying in the war.
Right. A lot of his friends are dying. A lot of, especially the one that just died. What's his name? That guy that died on one of the ships.
He was the captain of the Cortez. But he's just a representative to let us know that Sisko's losing a lot of people he loves.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
And he feels the weight of the world on his shoulders because he is in command of the Defiant. And he has a crew to take care of. But he just feels like, all these things are happening. Not only that, he's also the emissary. And, he's got a lot of things, and things are changing.
Running DS9 as
well. And he's got a lot of things going on. And then he starts having these visions. What happened to him when he starts to have the visions of, something happened to him prior to that? I know that he starts seeing people's faces.
Yeah, and then he walks around the ship. He's trying to figure it out. And before we know it, it's the 1950s.
Yes. Now, I have to say, before I go on to talk about the 1950s, I really like what they did with the characters in this episode, because they took all the characters that you would see in DS9, the regulars, Quark, the actors, and they become new characters of the 1950s, and they don't have any makeup on. So there are no aliens in the 1950s.
It's pretty cool. The first actor you see outside of Avery Brooks, I believe, is Aaron Eisenberg, who played Nog. He's like a paper boy in this episode.
Yes. And so in the 1950s, Benjamin Sisko is now Benny Russell. He works for a sci-fi magazine. It is good to note that he is a sci-fi writer amongst all white sci-fi writers. And there's a reason why I said that. So Quark is Herb, and Odo is this guy that they call Paps.
Could I make a quick suggestion, babe?
What?
I think for the sake of simplicity,
yes,
maybe we just refer to the characters as their regular characters.
Okay.
So if I refer to Odo, it's really we know it's not really Odo in this episode, but it makes it simpler for people to understand.
Okay, as I was saying, Odo he's the head of the magazine, correct?
Yeah, he's the editor.
So he's the editor of the magazine. He doesn't have a problem with Benny, but that he's not so. And Benny is trying to write the story about a captain on DS9 who just happens to be a black captain
named Benjamin Sisko.
He doesn't have a problem with him, but he doesn't know how that story is going to fly and if people are going to accept it. The other people are not on board with it either.
I don't know if I'd go that far.
You think they are?
They want the story to be published. Quark wants it to be published.
Actually, Quark does want it to be published, you're right.
Bashir likes it. Kira likes it.
Yes.
Dax, who is the secretary in this episode, she likes it. O'Brien is just sort of like worried about writing more stories about Android in this episode.
Actually, you are right. So I was wrong about that.
It's not that they don't like it. It's that society doesn't like it. And the publisher of the magazine has a problem with it.
That's why Odo, referring to Odo, he's not sure how it's going to fly, and he doesn't want it. He does not want it to be published because of how it's going to be received. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Meanwhile, in his personal life, there's a diner that he goes to. I know I'm skipping around.
No, that's fine.
But there's a diner that he goes to, and his girlfriend, Cassie, owns this diner, and...
she's about to buy the diner.
Yeah, she's about to buy the diner, Cassidy. is about to buy the diner, and she's thinking about their future and saying, look, I really want to buy this diner, and I really want to get married because I love you. And he's talking to her about publishing a story that he wrote for that sci-fi magazine. And in the midst of all that, he meets Jake, who plays this bum.
Jimmy. He's Jimmy in the episode, but you can call him Jake either way.
Jake/Jimmy. He doesn't think that there could be any black people on the moon, he says.
Only way we'd go there to shine their boots.
Right, exactly. That was actually the first time and maybe I don't know if I should say this.
Go ahead.
Or mention it, but that was really the first time I ever heard anybody in DS9 use a racial slur, but it was only to prove a point.
It's the only time in Star Trek I've heard somebody use the N-word. Now, they probably throw it around a lot on Discovery.
Uh-huh.
They probably have white guys throw it around all the time on Discovery. But as far as, like, classic Star Trek is concerned...
Well, probably other people throw it around, too.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't watch Discovery because the previews make it seem too woke for me. But
yeah.
As far as what I consider a classic Star Trek, it's the only time I can think of where you hear the N-word.
Right.
But it works in this episode.
Yep. There's other people he runs into. His father in the 1950s is this preacher that's talking to people about following the ways of the prophets. And he talks to Benny and says, you have to go on the path of the prophets. You have to tell your story. I liked him in this role. He kind of reminded me of like a Martin Luther King Jr. figure.
I definitely get that vibe.
Yeah. It almost like he could almost give the I have a dream speech.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I have a dream. But he was very good.
Well, we think Benny does have a dream, but keep on going.
He does have a dream.
Yes.
So he's trying to figure all this out. Meanwhile, he's starting to see people like this football player that looks just
baseball player.
Baseball. You said football.
Did I say football?
Yes,
I thought
you
it was
did.
Baseball. Okay, football player. I thought it was. Anyways, the sports guy.
Sports guy who looks just like Worf.
Yes.
He's kind of going back from the 1950s to the present.
Yes.
He sees him and Cassidy dancing.
That was a great scene.
Yeah, he sees him and Cassidy dancing in his quarters. Benny and Cassie are dancing in the 50s. He sees other people from the present time, and he's like, you know what? And he tells Cassie, he says, you know, I really don't feel good. I think I should lie down. She's feeling that he's really, really stressed out, and she's trying to calm him down and say, okay, it's all right, everything's gonna be fine, because she doesn't know what's going on in his head.
Benny doesn't even understand.
Benny doesn't even understand what's going on in his head. Fast forward to later in the episode, they're still having, his story actually does get published.
No.
No.
What happens is...
I thought it did.
No, here's what happens, babe.
Okay.
I
was wrong again.
Odo rejects the story, and 2 weeks later, Benny Russell comes back into the office with 6 new Deep Space Nine stories. Mm-hmm. Everybody around the office loves it. And I think it's Odo who suggests that, you could go to a small publishing house and have this printed up. And Kira says something to the effect of, yeah, but nobody's ever going to see those.
Right.
So they're debating it because it's so good, but the captain is black, and that was a big no-no back then.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And somebody suggests, well, what if at the end of the episode, the main character wakes up and we discover that this is a dream? Mm-hmm. Could we make that work?
Yeah.
Odo says he thinks so.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. So they're like, why don't we just make it like a dream?
Yes.
Why don't we make it... And I forgot that part. I'm sorry about that, folks.
That's right.
Yeah, and so... And he likes the idea.
Benny does, yes.
Yes, Benny likes the idea. He's like, okay, I'm on board with that. Maybe you should go on to explain the other part.
He's very, very excited about this. He goes out. He sees Jake/Jimmy walking, and he says, listen, we're going to go to the moon. And Jake's like, that's cool, man. I got to run. I got this big-time
business thing coming up. Yep.
some things happen. It's now that night. Benny is partying with Cassie.
Mm-hmm.
And we hear shots. Benny runs over. Galdicott had just killed Jake.
Because apparently he was supposedly breaking into this car.
Right. Benny gets upset and eventually gets beaten up by the cops.
2 of them.
Yes.
I think one of them may have been Rom.
It was either Rum or Wayoon. I wasn't sure. But
Couldn't tell.
irregardless of that, fast forward a couple weeks. He's just out of the hospital. Cassie is helping him. He's going to go down to the magazine and get the first run of his story, his published DS9 manuscript.
Yep.
Goes down to the office. Everybody's excited. We find out that O'Brien is going to get his Android novel published soon.
Mm-hmm.
But before that, before we get to read the Android book, Odo comes into the office and informs Benny that there will be no magazine this month because of the story of the Black Captain.
Right.
And not only that, but Benny Russell is fired.
Yep. And then he has this mental breakdown.
Yes.
In the middle of the office.
Which is, he should have won an Emmy for that.
He should have. I mean, that was a performance.
Yes.
And he was very good at that.
Yes. I mean, you could make the argument that this episode should have won multiple Emmys, but...
I know. It was very good.
He has a breakdown. It's so bad that they call the doctors to take him away.
Yeah.
They strap him up in an ambulance, and as he's riding in the ambulance, he starts to wake up and slowly transitions back to DS9.
So he's in sick bay. Cassidy's with him. And so is Jake. And so is his father.
Fast forward, we're at Ben Sisko's quarters. His dad walks in the room. He knows about the visions. He talks to him and he says, what if this isn't real? What if this is something that is just made up? It's just in Benny's head.
Mm-hmm.
And somewhere far beyond the stars, Benny Russell is dreaming of DS9.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now that we've discussed it and kind of butchered it, but got the essentials out.
Yeah.
Tell me your thoughts on this episode, because I have a few.
Okay.
And one more thing I want to say. Avery Brooks, who plays Ben Sisko, directed it.
I thought it was amazing.
Yes.
Yeah. I always wondered, and I know that we've talked about this before, how he was able to direct it when he was a big part. He was a main character in this episode.
But he did it, and he killed it.
He killed it.
Yep.
That's what I would tell him if I ever met him. You killed it. A good episode. You killed it. So I told you earlier that this episode was none like any other racially charged episode I ever saw in any 90s show. And that also includes sitcoms. Because a lot of the racially charged episodes mainly centered around Black history and or...
teaching a kid a lesson about racism.
Or police brutality or whatever it is. But this one, I thought that this episode really, really worked. And you mentioned that it was more of a believable storyline, right?
So I saw an interview with Avery Brooks where he said that the show is based in 1953. Mm-hmm. And I find it very easy to believe that in the 1950s, it would be hard for a Black author to be published and the audience knowing that he was Black if it was a mainstream magazine. Mm-hmm. I completely bought into the storyline.
Yeah. And I thought that it didn't sound like any typical racial storyline like you'd normally hear. And it worked really, really well.
It goes back to another thing that I've told you before. Many DS9 episodes are like many movies. Mm-hmm. Like, you don't see these characters. You know, you don't see Odo as the editor. You don't see O'Brien as the guy who's in the androids in other episodes.
Yep.
But you know these characters immediately. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And you don't just know them because of the actors who are playing them. You know who these characters are.
And it took 6 seasons for them to do that. And I thought that was great that they were able to do that.
What do you mean it took 6 seasons?
Well, no, because remember when you said that you were glad that it took them a while to do an episode like this?
Oh, yeah, I guess I should
Yes, that's what you said.
explain it a little bit better. I think the writers needed to understand the universe enough to do this episode.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think that by now, since we have gotten to know these regular characters, it was just so cool to see them out of their elements.
It was cool, but if they had replaced the regular cast outside of Avery Brooks and gone with all unknown actors, it still would have worked.
Yeah, I think you're right.
We still would have known the characters in this episode.
Yep, I think you're right. And the music was great.
Yes.
It's really good.
This is a very, very, very unique episode. I've only watched it once before this, and I liked it, but I didn't really understand how special it was until yesterday. It says a lot about race.
Yes.
But I want to get your thoughts on what it says about creativity.
I am amazed at the writers of this show so far. I don't know if there's any words that can really express my appreciation for the creativity of not just for this episode, but other episodes of DS9. I just think it's just from the technology on, the names of technology, the technological gadgets, the names of foods, the names of planets, the names of people, very creative.
Let me rephrase the question. And
I think you should, because I don't think I understand
talk
it.
to you a little bit about life or a book.
Okay.
As you know, there's not a lot of self-help books that I am a ride or die fan of, that I recommend to people all the time.
Yeah.
One of the exceptions to that rule is a book written by Stephen Pressfield called The War of Arts.
Yes.
I first read it in 2011, and I make a point of rereading it at least once a year. I've told you to read it. I've told other people. Sometimes people take me up on that. Sometimes they don't. But one of the things that Pressfield talks about is the idea of the muse and the idea of resistance. And he says resistance can take many different forms. For somebody, it might take the form of, I'm too old to do this.
Yeah.
For another person, it might take the form of, I don't have enough education to follow through on this plan.
Right.
With Benny Russell, it took the form of racism. But we could replace racism with resistance. Change those words. But Benny Russell was still a pro. He still showed up every day and wrote his stories about DS9.
Yep, he still kept going.
So what does Benny Russell not just say about racism, but what does he say about creativity and doing the work?
I'm thinking he's the type of person that is just like, I don't care what anybody says, I'm going to keep on doing my stuff.
Was he always like that?
Maybe not.
And we don't know.
I don't know.
For all we know, Benny Russell could have came from a successful family.
Right.
Because there were other black artists from the time who came from good families. Like,
Yep.
I believe Miles Davis's father was a dentist. And a fairly successful one. Or for all we know, his family was unsuccessful because of Jim Crow. We just don't know enough about Benny Russell. But I think Benny Russell is a really good example of how to be a professional.
Absolutely. And his work ethic showed that, even though he had some opposition, like, oh, we can't get black people on the moon, we can't do, that's not going to fly, it's not going to be accepted. He just kept going on.
Jimmy told him that.
Yes.
But he kept doing it.
He just kept doing it because he was like, you know what, I don't care, I need to get this out there, I want to get people to read this, and I'm going to do it no matter what my opposition is.
Society wants him to conform.
Yeah.
Whether it's Jimmy, whether it's Cassie saying, why don't we buy this restaurant and devote our lives to that, whether it's Odo. But Benny keeps on going until his breakdown.
Right.
Which kind of goes against the other thing that Pressfield says that I love, which is the muse keeps rewarding those who continuously show up.
The muse. What does he mean by the muse?
The muse is the creative force.
Okay.
You know.
Sounds a little too new agey for me, but...
I'm telling you, the book sounds new agey, but it's not that. It's so you could look at let's take Avery Brooks for an example, and I do want to focus on this episode. But
Yeah.
Avery Brooks was this guy who presumably struggled somewhat to become a successful actor and musician, but he put in the work. He showed up. He showed the muse that he was serious. He probably went on a lot of auditions, probably performed at many clubs, and then one day he becomes a success. And it's not one day. It's like it's building up. It's a culmination of things.
Right.
But he kept putting in the work, and as a result, he kept moving forward in his career. Does that make any sense?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to talk to you about my theory of what this episode is, and then what it may actually be. A thought that I have is when we first see Captain Sisko at the beginning of this episode, he's burnt out. Because so many of his friends are dying, the war is going strong, all that stuff. I believe that the experience he has in this episode is a vision that the prophets are giving him to let him know, one, that things could always be worse, two, to kind of think of reality as a dream state, and three, to let him know you're still going to have good times, but there's going to be some pain mixed in. And, you know, going to the last point, there's an interesting scene with his father, who's a preacher in this episode, who basically says something to the effect of, there's going to be good with the bad.
Right, exactly.
Once you speak your voice. So, again, my theory is that it's a vision, but there are other people who could say that this is really Benny's story and not Ben Sisko's story, and that all of Deep Space Nine is just in Benny's head. And we're watching the inside dreams of a writer from the 1950s who was discriminated against. What do you think of all this?
I don't know. It could be the other way around. It could just be that this is vision. These are just visions that the prophets give him. And I know you mentioned it, that this isn't really a Benny's dream. It's
Sisko's visions.
Sisko's visions, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's really Sisko's reality versus Benny's reality.
I go with it's Sisko's reality, but there is an interesting...
I think you're right, yeah.
There is an interesting argument to be made for the other way around. Yes. But I'm so glad that you enjoyed this.
I did. And I also understand why it would be divisive, but it is a good topic for conversation, I think.